Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Applied International Economic Policy. This is the 10th topic and our final topic for the course on the Phillips Curve, the relationship between inflation of prices or wages and the unemployment rates. The question we're going to be concerned with in its essence is the following: is the cost of higher employment always higher inflation? Why is this relevant to our course? Well, throughout this course, we've been looking at the effects of inequality on various other aspects of the macroeconomy, as well as other issues or sources of instability, like the climate crisis. And we've come to many conclusions that essentially call for higher government spending. Last time, we looked at one of the first common objections to an increase in government spending, namely the claim that public debts or a government deficit that finances government spending is ineffective, or the resulting debt creates instability. So we addressed that last week, and I think it's fair to say that such claims can be rebutted. Today we're going to look at another claim, another argument against increased government spending, namely the idea that increased government spending will lead to inflation. That is the subject of today's lecture. Today we will look at the Phillips curve, its history, its developments and evolution over time. That's in the first part. In the second part, then, we'll dive into the data. Unlike other aspects of this course, in other parts of the course, we started by looking at the data and seeing some empirical phenomenon and trying to explain it. Then this is going to be a little bit different insofar as we are looking at, in some sense, a theoretical construct, namely this Phillips curve, and then we're going to be looking for it in the data. So in this last week of material, we'll be doing things a little bit differently. Okay, then we'll link this Phillips curve to some theoretical explanation from a post-Keynesian, Kaleckian perspective, and then we'll finish with some policy implications, as always. So, what is the Phillips curve? It was first discovered or invented, depending on how you look at it, by Phillips, a New Zealander who was at the London School of Economics. He wrote a paper in 1958 looking at the relationship between wage inflation, that is, the rate of change of money wages, and unemployment in the United Kingdom between 1861 and 1913. And what he found was that there was this negative relationship, as you can see here. And this is taken directly from that paper that was released in 1958. Based on this, Samuelson and Solow, of course, two of the big names in modern economics and both Nobel laureates, did a very similar exercise 2 years later for the United States, this time instead of the United Kingdom. Again, on the y-axis, we have some variable capturing changes in wages, and again, on the x-axis, the unemployment rates. And so both of these papers point to this existence between, well, the change in the wage rates, so the wage inflation, is some negative function of the unemployment rate. So as the employment rate increases, we expect wage inflation to go down and vice versa. All right? So this is the first sort of origins. That Samuelson and Solow paper really, I guess in some sense, popularized what Phillips was writing about, especially because they really emphasize this trade-off between price inflation now, not wage inflation, and unemployment. So at the end of the paper, they say, well, due to the existence of a strong relationship between changes in wages and changes in prices, we can just replace on the y-axis the wage inflation rate by the price inflation rate. So here we have the average price rise per annum, but while remaining with the unemployment rates on the x-axis. Of course, this is not fitted to any data or anything. This is just a sort of hypothesized curve, if you like. So what Samuelson and Solow were emphasizing is that there appears, if we take this wage inflation Phillips curve seriously, then the related price inflation Phillips curve seems to suggest that policymakers have a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And now we can express the Phillips curve as well, the relationship between price inflation and the unemployment rates, where we still have that negative uh, relation. Okay. They also emphasize that the unemployment rates corresponding to price stability is to be found here at point A, and although they don't call it a natural rate of unemployment or a non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, um, they kind of highlight the existence of this point, where you have an unemployment rate where we expect to find no inflation, yeah, or a non-accelerating inflation rate. So the inflation rate at this point does not change. This kind of foreshadows what we're going to get onto a bit later, but anyway, we see the emergence here. So, given, if you like, this equilibrium natural unemployment rate, which here is around 5.5, based on how they drew their curve, any deviation from this NAIRU, this unemployment rate here, should reflect in higher or lower inflation. So if unemployment is above the NAIRU, then we should have deflation. If the unemployment rate is below the NAIRU at point A here, then we should have inflation. So in some sense, we're just expressing this relationship in slightly different terms by introducing this concept of some kind of unemployment rates which does not give rise to inflation. The general idea, the general conception behind the Phillips curve overall is that, well, when the unemployment rate is low, it means there's a lot of demand in the economy, and such a high amount of economic activity means that there's going to be a lot of, well, demands in search of relatively few goods. At the other side of the argument is the idea, well, when you have depression and so on, we expect not only to have high rates of unemployment, but the associated fire sale of stocks that had accumulated before the recession hit. So think here, Great Depression and so on. And so we'll likely have high unemployment and dangerous deflation. So that's the kind of two sides of the curve, if you like, and why at least at this point, in very loose language, we can expect there to be this. We kind of explain why there is this negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. But of course, it's all in very loose language, and the Phillips curve was often described as an empirical phenomenon in search of a theory. At the same time, it's a very useful construct to have because for policymakers, it shows that there is this direct trade-off, there is this sacrifice. If you want to lower the unemployment rates, which may be a clear policy objective, you have to accept that there will be an increase in inflation. So that's why it was so influential in policymaking and academic circles. But of course, something so simple, well, must surely be too simple, and that's indeed the case. In 1967, with the sort of monetarist or new classical writers, including Milton Friedman and Phelps, we have the emphasis of the role of expectations, which changes the common understanding of the Phillips curve and how it functions. We can see this in the following graph here on the left. Let's start at point A here, and here we have the Phillips curve as we know it so far, right? On the y-axis, we're back to our inflation rate, and the x-axis still unemployment rate. So we begin at point A. We have an inflation rate of P1, and we're at the NAIRU at this level here. So let's start by assuming we're in this equilibrium position. However, now government spending increases, which then lowers the unemployment rate to U2, as we'd expect, whether directly, if the government spends directly on hiring more people, or through indirect effects, we would expect unemployment to fall to U2. At the same time, given this logic, or given at least the purported existence of this Phillips curve, we would therefore expect inflation to rise from P1 to P2. We're going to get into the exact theory behind why this curve may or may not exist a bit later, but for now we're just going to pretty much take it as given. We're going to just say, okay, yeah, we're going from A to B, just because that appears to be empirically what happens. However, let's think through some of these effects, as Friedman in particular kind of argued. If you have an increase in government spending which gives rise to a lower unemployment rates at a higher price, or a higher inflation rate, then I just realized we should have hats on these little P's here because the hats denote the time rate of change. But anyway, you can take that as the inflation rates in any case. So, at the higher rate of price inflation, workers realize after time that their real wages have decreased. Why? Well, because their wages have stayed steady, but prices have increased, therefore their purchasing power, their real wages have fallen. As a result, the higher real wages that they demand, after realizing their real wages has fallen, they push for higher real nominal wages, therefore, to get back to the real wages they were starting with, will reduce unemployment, according to Friedman, back to our Nauru level. Why? Well, because when the workers start asking and demanding higher wages, and because there's greater competition between firms to employ labor, wages go up, and the firms cannot afford to pay so much, and therefore there's this fallback to this natural, so supposedly natural rate of unemployment here at U star. So that's why we go from B to C. The inflation rate stays the same, but we're now back to our initial unemployment rate, which is the Naira, or the natural rate of unemployment. Here we have a new short-run Phillips curve. It is simply the same as the old one in shape, but it is shifted out. Why? Well, because we're at the same inflation rates given the same unemployment rates. That's how we know it's shifted out. We can see this new Nauru as simply being like the one we've already seen, except we have the role of inflation of inflation expectations, and that's what we have here with this term right here. Because what Friedman and Phelps were really emphasizing is when firms set their prices, they need to take into account what they think the overall level of inflation will be. If they think it will be very high, then they're accordingly going to set their prices higher, right? Or if they think wages are going to rise, they'll set their prices higher. So their expectations really matter, and in fact this is a point that goes back to Keynes and before Keynes, back to Merdel and Wixel and so on. But here Friedman is really emphasizing it in the context of the Phillips curve. The expectation of inflation at P1 defines where this Phillips curve is. But if there's a higher expectation, then it will shift that curve out, right? The higher the inflation expectation, the higher or the more the curve is shifted out. However, the gradient of this curve is still staying the same, as reflected in this coefficient on B. Okay, so now we have a new kind of way of thinking about how this curve may shift, not just thinking about, well, in the old case, what the slope is and where it might intersect the x-axis and so on. We're now thinking about how it might shift based on the expectations of firms, producers, and consumers. Now, keep in mind that when Friedman was talking about expectations around inflation, the most common assumption about how expectations are formed is just to say, well, there are adaptive expectations, which generally just means I expect inflation in this period, let's say 2020, to be the same as the last period, 2019. Yeah, because of course we don't know exactly what inflation will be, but we have these rules of thumb which determine, which help us set our expectations. So adaptive expectations, the framework generally used by, well, the monetarists before the new classicals, if you like, is that, well, the expectation is that inflation will be the same as in the last period. The outcome of all this, this chain of logic is that any government spending will only increase inflation in the long run, right? So, right, there is the short-term effects of a decrease in the unemployment rates, but according to Friedman, that will only be short-term. The long-term effect is only going to be increasing inflation. Therefore, he argues, well, whatever about the short run, the long run Phillips curve is vertical. Government policy is ineffective. Okay, so given this framework and given this argument that Friedman was putting forward already in, well, the 60s, they were very much celebrated when the prediction that this Phillips curve may not be as sort of monotonous and predictable as everyone, well, as many expected before their arguments. Well, given their predictions were seemingly correct in the 1970s here, they were very much celebrated for their contribution. And we can see this in the data. So if we look at the 1960s, this is for the US, again, inflation rates, unemployment rates, we see for that decade, it looks very much like a sort of standard Phillips curve. But then we move into the 1970s, and each kind of corner on this line represents a data point, or for 1 year in that decade of 1970s, and what we see is it's just one big squiggle. And if we were to try and fit a line through the underlying data points, in fact, we'd have a line going up like this, right? Just a positive sloped anti-Phillips curve, if you like. So when this actually transpired in the data, Friedman and the related monetarists and new classicals, I guess a bit later, were celebrated as having seen this coming. However, at the same time, this is, of course, the period of the oil shocks. Oil being a massively important commodity for virtually all other goods and services in the economy, any increase in oil is certain to have a pass-through effect on the price of finished goods and intermediate goods reliant on oil. And of course, with well, the OPEC cartel actions of 1973 and 4 and later 1979 resulted in the massive spikes in the oil price that we see here and here. Surely, explains the largest part of this increase in inflation that we see in the 70s, rather than necessarily this argument that government spending led to increased expectations of inflation. So whether or not Friedman really could have seen the oil shock coming is, of course, that doesn't seem to be quite true. So the reason for this breakdown in the Phillips curve isn't the expectations necessarily, but much bigger determinants is just simply the fact that oil went up through the roof. In the later decades, we also see that, well, if we see it 1980, again, the Phillips curve is a bit all over the place. And again, it seems like there is, if anything, an upward best line of fits that would go through that data points. And then in more recent decades, the 90s and the 2000s in particular, we see really stable inflation kind of circling around 1 point. And we can get to we're going to speak quite a lot about that, the causes of this new kind of phenomenon in this week's reading. Largely has to do with the shift in monetary policy and how monetary policy is conducted, but the various other reasons we're going to get into. But for now, let's just kind of redefine our Phillips curve to include not only the effect of expectations and the unemployment gap, or the difference between the actual and equilibrium unemployment rates, but now let's also add for the possibility of supply shock. So the price of oil, the price of imported goods from abroad, and so on are clearly also relevant for formulating the rate of inflation. Once you start taking into account all these other things, then of course our relationship gets quite messy, and it really, it remains to be seen whether or not such a well-behaved sort of negative function like this exists or whether we can tease it out. And that's what we're going to focus on in a bit more detail. But despite the fact that it's not clear if this is still very useful, this notion of a Phillips curve, it's still very much used in theory today. In fact, it really guides a lot of not only sort of workhorse models like the new consensus model, the three equation model, um, developed by Colin Soskich, where the change in the inflation in the interest rate set by the central bank can be seen to have an effect on outputs. That change in output then will give us some relation to inflation via the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve is still central. We don't need to get into the new consensus model, but it's still central in these models, despite the fact that there is not really a consensus on whether the Phillips curve and the related NAIRU, or natural rate of unemployment, are still empirically relevant, whether or not this relationship actually holds. I just pulled up a few quotes on the matter from various policymakers and academics. First one is from a board member of the Federal Reserve, speaking in 1997, who says that, well, the truth that the Phillips curve in its modern expectations augmented form, so the Friedman form, was the stable, most stable and useful econometric tool in a forecaster's arsenal for most of the last 15 years. In 2019, the San Francisco Federal Reserve President Mary Daly said, as for the Phillips curve, most arguments today center around whether it's dead or just gravely ill. Either way, the relationship between unemployment and inflation has become very difficult to spot. Taking a more econometric approach, these two academics concluded that our results contrast sharply with the conventional wisdom. We find that over the last 15 years, all three sets of NAIRU Phillips curve-based inflation forecasts have been no more accurate than the forecast from our naive model that inflation over the next year will be equal to inflation over the previous year. We conclude that NAIRU Phillips curves are not useful for forecasting inflation. Now, this is quite a strong conclusion, and one that a good number of economists hold, namely that, well, Phillips curves, perhaps there was some correlation in the 60s and so on, but the data has just become so messy that it's a bit of a fool's game to try to define some sort of NAIRU, some equilibrium unemployment rates, and find some slope between the two variables. Nonetheless, as we see, it's still very relevant. So now let's try to, I guess in some sense, grasp for our own purposes whether or not the Phillips curve is still relevant for a bunch of economies. So we're basically going to dive into the data on unemployment and inflation with data from the OECD and the European Commission. For the period mostly of 1960 to 2018, but I'll have some countries in here, such as Russia and so on, which obviously won't be over the same period. But let's have a look. So we'll just begin very naively, almost a la Phillips himself and Samuelson and so on, who just looked at these correlations. Of course, we're looking at a relation which really has other things determining the inflation rate on the y-axis. So a simple correlation isn't a proof of the existence of this relationship or anything. But nonetheless, let's begin there and then kind of work our way up. So here we have Austria and the Czech Republic. Clearly shows some kind of Phillips curve, or at least some sort of negative relationship as expected. And here I've broken it down in R by decade as well to see, well, are there any changes over the decades? And for Austria, it looks pretty consistently negative. Czech Republic, to some extent, too, although, of course, there's less data for Czech Republic. Denmark, Finland, looking as we'd expected, but now we're starting to see, when we look at some of these decades, especially here for Denmark in the 1970s, we see that same sort of stagflation that the US and other countries experienced. France, Germany, a similar situation, downward conventional Phillips curves. Although by decade it can be a little bit different, right? Greece, pretty strong downward trend. Same for Iceland. I'm just going to jump through them now. Ireland, quite a moderate downward trend. Italy, less moderate. Japan clearly has a downward trend, and in fact, it looks quite non-linear. It looks like you can almost put a sort of L curve or some sort of curve through that. Luxembourg, clearly downward trending. Now we're just going to jump through. So for this bunch of countries, the correlation is clearly a negative one. Okay. So with Russia here, we see a negative trend, but of course there's also this clear outlier which may be driving the trend. And in fact, when I removed it, it suddenly started trending upwards. So of course, be careful as you look at these sorts of things in the data that you ask yourself the relevant questions, especially those related to outliers and so on. Okay, so here we see in a bunch of these economies, just from a glance, it seems that the Phillips curve is in some sense alive and conventional. But there are counterexamples. Australia, Canada clearly have an upward trending Phillips curve for the period of analysis, and the decade breakdown really is a bit all over the place. Hungary and Korea. Mexico pretty much flat, and perhaps in some sense driven by some outliers as well that could be corrected for. Poland, Slovakia, United States. Now the United States is a very interesting one because of course we already saw that Samuelson and Solo found data in wage inflation showing a conventional Phillips curve, or suggesting one. And here in inflation over all the decades, we see that it's pretty much upward sloping. So we're going to kind of return to this in a little bit, but it's interesting to see that one of the economies where the Phillips curve is most often used for forecasting and so on has, at least on first glance, an absence thereof. Of course, we need to control for other variables before we can conclude. Chile, Indonesia. Okay, so we see here that we have plenty of what appear to be outliers, or at least it just shows that the relationship is not as strong as perhaps we would expect for a theoretical construct and an empirical sort of stylized fact that has become so dominant within the profession of economics. Let's focus on the US because that clearly is one of the world's major economies, but also where a lot of the debate took place. And just for out of interest, let's look at the wage rate of inflation on the y-axis rather than the price rate of inflation. Now, if we change that out, that dependent variable, we see more of a Phillips curve phenomenon for a similar period of analysis. Although it goes back a bit further now. So this kind of shows that, well, it depends also what dependent variable you're interested in. And sometimes it seems that wage growth is much more closely related to the unemployment rates than inflation is, as perhaps you might expect. If we break it down by time period, so here the 20 years between 1948 and 1968 is clearly very negative. Coordinates on the unemployment rate is minus 1.34. So for every increase in the unemployment rate, let's say from 4 to 5%, we'd expect wage growth, or the inflation of wages, to go down by 1.34 percentage points. Here, during the period of the oil shocks and so on, we see the opposite trend, so the stagflation period, and then again a kind of return to a conventional setup in more recent years. Before we get into the econometrics, I thought it'd be interesting just to look at the panel of all, so a combination of the data for all the countries we've seen so far. So not looking at each country, but just looking at a panel thereof. And then we see more of a negative downward trend in the line of best fit. Perhaps even non-linear if you want to try to fit a line that is, well a function that is not a line. Interestingly, and this is what I want to focus on here, if we break it down by, well, not decades, but periods of around 15 years or so, we see that it appears that across this panel, the Phillips curve is downward sloping, but it appears to be getting flatter, right? Especially this dark blue curve is relatively steep, and then already it looks almost flat. And the same could be said for the most recent period. This is a phenomenon that has attracted a lot of attention in recent years. We're going to be discussing a little bit during our reading group on Thursday. The Economist had a nice graph on this matter, where on the x-axis they use cyclical unemployments, whereas of course I've been using just the simple unemployment rate the whole time. Proponents of the Phillips curve argued you should always use cyclical unemployments, which is, as we've seen, the unemployment rate minus the natural rate of unemployment. The problem with doing so is that to find the natural rate of unemployment is a very difficult thing to do because it is not observable. So you have to somehow estimate it, which can be done if the natural rate of unemployment, or the NAIRU, I should really say, because there's nothing natural about the NAIRU. But the NAIRU, if the NAIRU is constant over time, then there are econometric ways of doing this. But if it's not, as a lot of economists have argued and found, then it becomes a bit like trying to find a needle in a haystack, and very dubious altogether. But anyway, nonetheless, this is what the Economist newspaper or magazine has done here. And for their analysis, you can see the same relationship where the Phillips curve maybe once was a dominant trend across advanced economies, but has become less of a strong relation over time. This is extremely relevant for policymaking, especially if you're relying on that Phillips curve to, well, help you forecast what inflation is going to be next year and so on. Okay. But let's finish, as we should, with the econometric evidence, where we account for other variables other than just, well, unemployment. So now I'm going to summarize the work found, work done by the OECD, IMF, and European Commission on the Phillips curve, where in all of these papers they have used various variables other than just the unemployment rate or the unemployment gap, such as controlling for supply shocks. In this paper in particular, in the OECD one at least, they control for imported inflation, but in others they control for the price of oil and so on. And here they have a lagged variable, a lagged inflation rate, so that in some sense gives us the the expectations in an adaptive framework for, well, inflation will be next year. Well, it will probably be equal to the inflation in the period before. And here we have some difference between the central bank's inflation targets, for most countries around 2%, and the inflation in the last period, because this will also tell us how the central bank will react to some extent. Okay, so the question is this variable, this unemployment variable, or unemployment gap in this case, is the coefficient on this variable statistically significant? Firstly, we would expect from what has gone before, for this to be positive, such that when you have the actual unemployment rates below the NAIRU here, then you would have, well, a positive number, and so that contribution to inflation over here would be positive. So we'd expect alpha to be positive, right? So that's sort of prediction A. We'd expect alpha to be positive. But prediction B is, well, we expect it to be statistically significant if it is at all genuinely relevant for explaining inflation. But as we can see from this summary of the work done, the coefficient on this unemployment gap variable, that's what this is here, is either negative, as in the case of the UK, at the 10% significance level, or simply statistically insignificant, as in the case of Canada, Austria, Belgium, Estonia, France. So all of those highlighted cases show, a Phillips curve that is basically not statistically significant. As I fleetingly mentioned already, the NAIRU is unobservable, so estimating this is already a bit difficult. And some econometricians argue, well, it's very, it's very difficult to do if possible at all, especially if it's changing all the time. Okay, so essentially that's it for the data. Um, what we can see is that it appeared to be a much more relevant empirical phenomenon for many countries around the world up until at least the 70s, so a few decades at least. Um, and it kind of got taken for granted, this notion of a negative relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. And it became such a central pillar of much of macroeconomic theory that it became almost indispensable for forecasting and just theorizing about how the economy is run. But the data on the matter is far from conclusive or concrete. In the next part of this lecture, we're going to go into a bit of theory about why the Phillips curve may or may not exist. So we're going to start with an explanation of how the Phillips curve arises at all. Then we're going to, in a more speculative part, perhaps give an explanation as to perhaps why it did not stick around um, in many countries. Okay, so I'll see you in the next parts of this video lecture.